I'd now like to introduce Paul Twivy. He's the Chief Executive of the Big Society Network. Now, Paul actually set up the network earlier this year with NatWay, who has now been appointed to the House of Lords to actually advise the government on this agenda. So, many of us fail to connect or really have any idea what this big society is all about. So hopefully Paul will be able to shed a little bit of light on it. Over to you, Paul.
Morning, or afternoon as it just is, according to Big Ben. It's a pleasure to speak to you, and congratulations on a brilliant initiative as the father of 5 children, which is why I've got no hair left. I totally applaud the Synod Fellowship and the idea of outward-facing schools. How can schools be anything else? So I'm not going to claim to be an expert on this area. I will hope to give you, over the next 20 minutes in speaking in a Q&A, some sense of how schools might practically connect with the Big Society agenda. But I'm going to try and explain, as many have, what I think the Big Society is about or could be about. So I'm going to start with a paradox, and it's this. 2 out of 3 adults in this country believe that Britain is broken. 1 out of 3 believe it strongly, and that's before we got onto the cuts and the winter of discontent that we might be about to face. And the phrase broken Britain, which actually came out of Ian Duncan Smith's work on poverty and why several prime ministers have been through various sink estates and millions of pounds have been poured into them, but essentially the residents and citizens felt the same about their lives. And it's the idea, I suppose, of a social recession as great in significance, if not greater in significance, as the economic recession. And it creates kind of very often hysterical reactions, that phrase, as indeed has the Big Society as the possible antidote, if you like, to broken Britain. So I want to just look at a set of facts, the bleak realities, but suggest that there's a paradox, because actually there is a great cause for optimism, even in the times that we're facing at the moment. And I'm sure the kind of initiative that you all represent is one of those reasons for optimism. So on the one hand, let's stare up to the reasons why people talk about broken Britain. First of all, social isolation. We have 7 million people living on their own in England and Wales, and it's predicted to rise to 9 million. And whilst living on your own doesn't automatically equate to loneliness, you could be lonely in this room, lonely in a crowd, lonely in a family, it is an indicator. And half of those households are pensioners. We have a recent Mental Health Foundation report which says that 1 in 10 adults regularly experience loneliness, which probably means it's 3 or 4 times that amount, because there's a certain stigma attached in looking at it. The Royal Mail, through their postman, find 4 or 5 people dead on the floors of their homes or flats every week between that body of people who go out into our streets, because nobody knows that they've died, nobody is there, no neighbours are there for them. 97% of our neighbourhoods have become more fragmented, statistically more fragmented than they were in 1971. We have tremendous amounts of inequality in this country. I think the worst statistic that I've come across is that the average life expectancy difference between the richest and poorest in this country is 14 years. And as John Ruskin said, there is no wealth but life and health. And that we live in a country where the difference is 14 years according to how wealthy you are cannot be right. And I'm not trying to make a political point, I'm trying to make a human point. We also feel disempowered. So 61% of us feel we can't affect local decisions, and it's even higher for national decisions. Only 3% of us go to public meetings, possibly because public meetings aren't very well conducted, and only 26% of us take part in any formal volunteering, that's once a month or more, and that figure has declined. Only slightly, but it has declined. So those are some of the facts, and I think we need to look at them. I think we are looking at them, and we're looking at them on top of, the economic recession and the cuts that are about to be announced. But there is something else which I find invigorating in the current atmosphere, or the atmosphere of the last 2 years, and that's anger. That is frustration. Frustration and anger at the square mile around us, at the square mile in the city, and I'll come on to talking about square miles in a second. Because I think if we can tap into the energy, the hunger for democracy, the hunger for change, the desire not to be disempowered, the desire not to be lonely, the desire to have strong communities without that being worthy, then we can effect a revolution, which is what the Big Society is all about. And why do I believe, and others believe, that it can happen? Well, there are, on the other side of a kind of Berlin Wall, if you like, that I think we can knock down, not visible enough to us, in other words, in many cases, 900,000 to 1 million community groups in this country. That's 1 for every 6 people in the country. There are 238,000 social entrepreneurs. Many of them come from incredibly tough backgrounds. They're much more gender balanced than commercial enterprise. They're much less educated, and only 1% of them get formal funding. So imagine you could take the power of 900,000 to 1 million community groups. Imagine you could signpost them, find them, support them, connect to them through schools, being one classic example. Imagine if just 3% of social entrepreneurs got funding instead of just 1%. What could happen? Because the truth is the big society isn't David Cameron's invention. The truth is that this country, or these countries that make up the United Kingdom plural, could not survive without those organisations, without this extraordinary outburst of energy, much of which is probably not captured in those official volunteering statistics, by the way. But I think what we need to break down that Berlin Wall is we need to give people a very simple, practical, empowering guide to what's going on in their community and how they can affect change. And this is the Big Society agenda. Now, the Big Society is 3 things. One is it's an ideology by a political party. It's the Prime Minister's personal passion, and I think he feels it very, very deeply. But it's divisive even within the Tory party. It was seen not to win an election, and it's a hot potato. And Ed Miliband talks about good society, and Liberal Democrats talk about localism. And I think in essence, that, of course, that matters enormously in political debate. But it doesn't matter a fig when it comes to, are we basically going to change our society? Because the values and the history, and actually the political ideologies, merge as one when it comes down to very practical things. I'll give you an example that was given to me recently. In tough estates in Glasgow, a lot of the mums get given a £38 voucher to buy school things for their children, so very relevant to schools. And most of them don't have a bank account, most of them don't have relevant forms of ID, and so they go to the loan shark in the estate, and he takes £8 off for the privilege of cashing the voucher, and they get £30, and they have 1 or 2 or 3 less items for their child for school. So that's a direct relevant schools example. So somebody just observing this on the estate said enough is enough. They went to the person I was talking to. He backed them to set up a bank. I mean, not a bank in a grand sense, but just a cash bank within the estate, where the only ID you need is a photograph and the personal knowledge of that person in many cases. And they will give you £38 of cash for your £38 school voucher. That is the Big Society. It's insights into things like that, the practical realities. And this isn't just about Cinque Estates, it's about the entire UK, because we are suffering many kinds of poverty, not just literal poverty, but poverty of isolation, spending too much time in screens and not with each other. So that's an example, and I think actually what's needed is an accumulation of small, practical actions in one-to-one mentoring relationships, and those often start, and the habit for those start in schools.